Chapter 19. Andrew watched Grace and Lily on the far side of the low table. Lily'd fallen asleep moments after the jet reached cruising altitude, her head in Grace's lap, her thumb in her mouth. They'd originally planned to stay the night in Austin. Andrew had been looking forward to taking the girls to dinner and spending the evening with them. But Grace had suggested they see if they could return to New Hampshire immediately so Lily wouldn't miss school and he wouldn't miss work. Little though he'd wanted to, he'd called the flight crew, who'd had the jet ready by the time they returned to the airport. Grace gazed down at the child, brushing tendrils of brown hair away from her cherubic face, expression filled with love. He'd always been good at reading people, but his first impression of Grace had been so far from accurate, it was laughable. It was obvious that, despite how hard she seemed to try to keep it from happening, she'd fallen completely in love with Lily. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. If they could prove Myron wasn't Lily's father, then maybe Grace could try to get custody. But it all felt so convoluted. If Lily wasn't Myron's daughter, then whose was she? Where were her real parents? Were they looking for her, praying for her safe return? Were they praying at that very moment, begging God to take care of their child? At least God had gotten Lily out of Myron Bowman's grasp and into Grace's protection. He hadn't broached the subject with her yet, but obviously Grace would need to call the social worker and tell her what they'd learned. The state would take it from there, wouldn't they? A simple paternity test could put the matter to rest, assuming Myron ever turned up. But maybe he was long gone. Maybe he'd given up on Lily. If he wasn't actually the child's father, then would he dare come around again? Was he a kidnapper as well as a pornographer? Either way, he needed to be punished for his crimes. Too bad hanging wasn't still a thing, though Andrew could think of even more appropriate punishments, which involved the removal of toenails without the benefit of painkillers. That would be a start, still not as bad as someone like Myron Bowman. What are you thinking about? On the far side of the table, Grace studied him with narrowed eyes. Nothing. He didn't figure explaining the torture he'd subject Myron to would be appropriate conversation even if Lily was sound asleep. And it wasn't exactly romantic. Not that he should be thinking about romance. Truth be told, when he wasn't contemplating hurting the man who'd hurt that child, he was thinking about romance. And why not? Grace was single. He was single. They got along well, had the same values. He'd first been attracted to her because she was beautiful. Now he knew that beauty went much deeper than skin level. He was attracted to her looks, no doubt, but he was falling for the woman behind the face. Falling for her like he'd never fallen for another woman. Lily shifted, and Grace took the opportunity to slip out from beneath her head. She stood and watched until Lily settled back into a deep sleep. She's a sound sleeper. Grace tipped her head toward the seats across the aisle. I'll join you. He grabbed 2 bottles of water from the fridge in the back and took the chair beside Grace's, handing her one. The seat swiveled, and he angled to face her. Thanks. She palmed it open and sipped. I know you weren't thrilled to be headed back tonight. He thought he'd hidden that well, but Grace was astute. Just enjoying your company. Her smile was shy. Feelings mutual. No idea what to say to that. He just held her eye contact, trying to read her thoughts. She didn't seem immune to him. Did she feel half of what he felt? Did she feel the attraction that pulsed between them? I appreciate all you did today, she said. All you've done for us. Without your help, I could never have figured out half of what we learned. Though he cared about Lily, they'd talked enough about the girl. It was my pleasure. Grace gazed out the window and said nothing else. Her hand was lying casually on her armrest. More than anything, he wanted to slip their palms together. He'd never in his life, not even as a middle school boy with his first crush, wanted to hold someone's hand like he wanted to hold hers. He trailed his fingers over her forearm. Slowly, Grace turned to him, but she didn't pull away. He reached the back of her hand and traced the tiny veins, then made little circles on her skin, feeling a zing of satisfaction when he saw goosebumps rise at his touch. Into the silence, while his fingers trailed along her skin, he asked the question that had been hovering in the back of his mind for days. Will you explain to me why I can't hold your hand? Though she didn't move, the muscles of her arm tensed, and he knew he had only seconds before she extricated herself from his touch. Very lightly, he wrapped his thumb and forefinger around her wrist. keeping it on the armrest between them. "It's okay. You don't have to." She didn't pull away. After a moment, he let go, and his fingertips resumed their exploration. That she didn't move. It was something. It wasn't what he wanted. To be honest, holding her hand wasn't all he wanted either. But he felt like he'd never get to the kisses, the embraces he craved, if he didn't understand her fear of touch. And that was what it had to be. A fear. Maybe he could make her feel comfortable with him. Maybe he could prove to her that he wasn't a monster, that he'd never hurt her, that he'd never do anything to make her fear him. For now, if that meant that he confined himself to touching the back of her hand, he'd do it. He'd do whatever it took. That was who he was, after all. When his father had cut Andrew off because he refused to promise to work for the family business when he graduated from college, Andrew had gotten a job to pay his own way. When he'd been convicted of a crime he didn't commit, he'd worked in the infirmary, proving his skills until he was trusted with as much responsibility as was given to any inmate. When he was released but had lost his place in the pre-med program, he'd redirected his goals, double majoring in biochemistry and business, and earning a scholarship to pursue his MBA. At work, Andrew was tireless in his pursuit of B&B's goals, and the company's increased profits reflected his efforts. Soon enough, he'd know why the family business was losing money. He'd get to the bottom of that mystery and prove his worth to his father. When Andrew decided to do something, he did it. In that moment, he decided he wanted Grace, and Lily, if the girl was part of the package. God had brought these two into his life, and he wasn't going to let them go. If that meant starting with tracing tiny circles on the back of Grace's hand, then so be it. He could be patient. The best dreams were worth waiting for, fighting for. And Grace? Andrew had a lot of dreams for his life, but she was definitely the best of them. He didn't know how much time had passed before Grace pulled her arm out from beneath his touch and swiveled to face him. "I'll tell you if you promise to keep an open mind." His heartbeat raced. She'd trusted him with the story of her stepfather. Now she was willing to trust him with this. Of course. Though why she thought he'd need to be open-minded to hear about her fear of touch, he didn't know. "Remember I told you about how I knew my stepfather was a bad man?" He dipped his head. "You're very intuitive." "Not exactly." "What did that mean?" "It's that when I hold people's hands, I get these." "What?" He leaned toward her. "It's okay. You can tell me." "Visions." He sat back. "Visions?" Her eyebrows hiked. "You promised to keep an open mind." "It's open, but I see things, feel things. Not every time, and the visions aren't always intense. When I was young, it was just feelings. The feeling I had when I first met my stepfather? It was lust, though I don't think I had a name for it back then. But I knew it was a dark feeling. Like," she rubbed her lips together. "I don't know how to explain it. I sort of feel what other people feel, and sometimes I see what they saw, like their memories." When Lily grabbed my hand, I saw her looking in a mirror, hair and makeup done up like one of those kids who do fashion shows. But she was wearing this little, "Don't tell me." He hated to be rude. "I don't want that image in my head." Her cheeks turned red and she angled away. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't mean. She's so innocent. I don't want to see her like that. I try to guard against that kind of thing." She nodded slowly, turning back. Her gaze was intense when it met his. "As do I." By her tone, he knew her words held deeper meaning, but he wasn't grasping it. He wanted to, though, because what she was describing was impossible. Impossible, but Grace wasn't a liar, and she wasn't crazy, which left only one option. She was telling the truth. "You saw Lily," he prompted, hoping she'd be vague. "In the mirror, and then on a bed, looking at a camera. And just by the way it felt, I knew. And then Myron came over and introduced himself, and I shook his hand, just to be sure. And it was like a Rolodex of photos that flipped. Children, always children. Beds and lights and cameras and..." Her voice trailed and she added, "Sorry, too much information." "No, it's..." He tried to come up with an end to that sentence. "It's not usually pictures. That's really rare, and weirdly, always related to some sort of abuse or trauma. Usually, all I feel is strong emotion. Mama Lucy, she's the house mother where I used to live. She and I did a lot of thinking and praying about it. She thinks it's the person's strongest emotion or most frequently felt emotion. If I hold on a long time to somebody, I can sort of clue into everything they're feeling. But in quick handshakes, quick touches, I don't think I feel what they're feeling in that second. I feel what they often feel, if that makes sense. He considered that, then remembered the night before. She'd worn gloves when she'd shaken everybody's hands, except one. When you touched Chet's palm, she licked her lips, looked away. I don't share what I learn. It's not exactly fair, is it? To use it against people? He didn't push the issue. Is that why you wear gloves? To protect people's privacy? It's more like what you said earlier. It's to protect myself, my heart. It's been a part of me as long as I can remember, so I never thought about it as invading people's privacy. When I was little, it was just impressions. It's gotten stronger over the years, especially since I became a Christian. He was almost afraid to ask his next question. Her slight smile gave him the courage. When you shook my hand, could you tell me that? No pictures, just an impression. Which was ambition, but it was a glowing emotion. She looked down like she was embarrassed about what she'd said, as if that was any weirder than the rest of it. Meaning? Emotions are rarely neutral. Usually they're either dark or light. Some are so dark they feel like pits. When I touch somebody whose emotions are that dark, it feels heavy, like I'm being pulled down. And then others' emotions are so bright that they glow. Is it the intensity of the emotion? He asked. Am I freakishly ambitious? Dangerously, like Hitler or something? Her laugh loosened some of the knots in his stomach. Not at all like that, she said. More like with Barney, my stepfather. I've gotten the impression of lust plenty in my life. But with Barney, it was that bottom of a pit feeling I get. It was evil. I see, so glowing is good? Yes. She nodded to emphasize the point. Yes, glowing means it's good. Because emotions are morally neutral, right? It's not the emotion that's good or bad. It's where it comes from and what you do with it. Ambition is a great example. Hitler was ambitious and deep pit evil. Einstein was ambitious in his own way, I think. But his, I assume, was glowing. Not that those would be their defining emotions. I'm just trying to give an example. She shook her head. Anyway, with you, I felt glowing ambition. But I also felt kindness, generosity. Everything about you was good. I felt no dark pit emotions. Not that you're perfect, but there was nothing about you that worried me or scared me. I knew you were safe. You still feel that way? She nodded. The more I get to know you, the more I believe my initial impression was correct. She'd rested her arms on the armrests again. He settled his hand on her forearm. If shaking my hand wasn't bad, would holding my hand be? Her gaze flicked to his fingers, resting lightly against her skin. I just never know when I'm going to get a vision or, once I get to know a person, it feels sort of intrusive. But now I know. He inched his hand closer to hers. I don't mind if you intrude. Though a tiny part of him worried about what she'd perceive in him. He cataloged his feelings. She'd probably pick up on his desire. But he was pretty sure it was bright, not dark. To use her terms, all he felt for her was good. All he wanted for her was good. Would she know that? Would she trust him more? She swallowed, then flipped her hand over. He slid his palm against hers, reveling in her smooth skin, in the warmth that traveled up his arm, straight to his heart. Only a second passed before she said, My initial impression was correct. She smiled and leaned toward him. You are a good man. He couldn't think of a thing to say. She was so close that he caught a light scent of mint on her breath. What did she feel coming from him? Did she know the depth of his feelings for her? If she did, the fact that she hadn't pulled away meant something. Maybe she felt something for him as well. He stared into her eyes, thankful to be holding her hand, but unwilling to settle for that. Ambitious. Her assessment was correct. The instant he got what he wanted, he created a new goal. And the new goal now, his gaze flicked to her lips. They looked so soft. He longed to feel them against his own. Her mouth spread into a slight smile, and he looked back into her eyes. Is it? May I? She nodded and he closed the distance between them. When they connected, he had to fight the urge to pull his hand away, because all the feelings shooting through him. Let them be bright, Lord. Let them be good. Desire, overwhelming desire, protectiveness, need. With everything in him, he wanted more of this, more of her. Afraid he would scare her away with the intensity of his feelings, he knew he needed to pull his hand from hers. But before he could, she tightened her grip. Fine then. She would know it all. One way or another, there was no hiding from Grace. His other hand found its way into her hair, the silky strands brushing against his rough skin. He deepened the kiss, leaning closer to her, only then realizing he was kneeling on the floor in front of her. When had that happened? He didn't know. He didn't care. He needed to get himself under control. He managed to pull his lips from hers, but only to trail kisses along her cheeks, toward her ear. She tilted her head to the side, giving him more access. He groaned. He had to stop. With all his self-control, he managed to sit back on his heels. Had he frightened her with the intensity of his desire? He'd frightened himself. He'd never felt this for another woman, never even come close. He was afraid to meet her eyes, but her hands still held his. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to hers. She was watching him, her expression beautiful and filled with, was that wonder? Maybe. Maybe that was what she felt. He wanted to know. He'd never in his life wanted so much to know what was going on in another person's mind. He leaned forward and rested his forehead against hers, trying to catch his breath, trying to understand what he'd just experienced, knowing that after this, he would never be the same.
Chapter 20. Grace was falling. Falling, though she hadn't left her seat. Andrew's forehead pressed against hers, his hand still holding hers. She'd never experienced anything like that. The kiss alone had been utterly mind-blowing, life-altering. It was ridiculous. It was only a kiss. Only it wasn't, because as his lips had moved against hers, she'd felt what he was feeling. Those emotions had all gotten mixed up and jumbled and… Grace! His voice was low and rough, and she felt another wave of desire, not knowing if it was from him or from her, or some combination of both. She slid her fingers through the hair at the back of his neck, and he groaned. Everything in her wanted to kiss him again, kiss him for the rest of her life. He shifted, nuzzled his head against her neck. I need to know. His words trailed, but she felt his fear. Yes, she said, yes to all of it. His fear was replaced with elation, and she almost giggled. She had to stop. She pulled their joined hands away from her body and let go. In the last second before his palm separated from hers, she felt his disappointment. He lifted his head and leaned back, meeting her eyes. She saw apology there. She slid her hand around the back of his neck. I want to know how I feel, she said. It's all mixed up. I need to know. His lips cut off her words, and she felt awash in feelings again, all bright and beautiful. Not nearly enough time had passed before he pulled away, breathless. He leaned back to see her face, eyes wide and expectant. A blush heated her cheeks, and she started to look down. No fair. She had no reason to fear. She knew that. She knew him. Desire, she said. More than anything, like I've never felt before. A grin spread across his face. Safe, protected, cherished. I felt joy. Just pure joy. He pressed his hands to the sides of her face. I've never felt so known. I've never felt so… Despite everything, she was afraid to name the emotion, afraid it was revealing so much. But he wasn't afraid. Unlike her, he was brave. Loved, he said. I hope that's how you felt, as crazy as it seems. I don't understand, but I feel it too. How did this happen? I don't know. I'm just glad it did. Yes. And yet. Lily! She glanced across the aisle at the sleeping little girl. Don't do that, Andrew said. Now who's reading minds? I see it in your eyes. You're pulling away from me. You're putting her between us. She is between us, Andrew. I have to keep her there until she's safe. He gazed at Grace a long moment before he sat in his seat again and leaned his head against the headrest. You understand, don't you? She asked. We're going to find her family. He turned and held his hand out, palm up. She took it, felt conviction, confidence. We're going to prove Myron isn't her father, Andrew said. We're going to make sure she's safe, I promise. But we're going to do it together. You and me. Don't put up a wall between us, Grace. It's too late for that. He was right. She felt it. She knew it. Because at some point, at 30,000 feet, in the sky somewhere between Texas and New Hampshire, she'd fallen in love. But until Lily was safe, she couldn't let herself be ruled by that. She couldn't let that matter. Lily was the priority, and if Grace had to run again, then she'd run. Even if it meant leaving her heart with this man. Even if it meant never seeing him again. You don't love me! Lily's shrill scream sent Grace's pulse racing. Keep your voice down, she said, and don't talk to me in that manner. It is unacceptable. What are you going to do, get rid of me? That's what you're trying to do anyway. I hate you. I hate you. The child swiveled and pounded up the stairs, hair half-brushed in preparation for school that day. The sound of a slamming door reverberated through the small condo. Grace collapsed on the couch and dropped her head into her hands. She hadn't meant to hurt her feelings. She'd only asked what else she remembered about her Nana and other family members at the old rock house. What do I do, Lord? Grace was trying to get rid of her. She had to find somebody to take her. The little fantasy she'd been entertaining, the one where she and Lily lived happily ever after, had shifted during the flight the previous day, after the kiss she refused to think about. Kisses. Mind-blowing kisses, and all the overwhelming emotions that went with them. Ever since then, her fantasy family of 2 had morphed into a family of 3. Andrew, Grace, and Lily, making a forever home together, complete with a little house surrounded by snow-covered New Hampshire mountains, cozy winter nights with a flickering fire in the hearth, a child curled up on a fluffy white rug, arms wrapped around Regis, Oliver lounging nearby. Grace had fallen asleep with the scent of wood smoke hovering in her imagination. But the nightmares had been worse than ever. Celia gripping Grace's hand, all the girl's thoughts and feelings on display for Grace to experience. She'd done everything in her power to protect her, to love her. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. She hadn't been able to save Celia, and she couldn't save Lily. The child needed somebody who could. Which was why Grace had gone to Texas that weekend, to find the girl's family, somebody who could take her. Even if it broke Grace's heart to think of giving her up, Lily would be better off with somebody else. And truth be told, so would Andrew. That thing that people had, the thing that connected them with others, that enabled them to love, Grace didn't have it, never had. She'd never felt connected to her mother. She'd loathed her stepfather. She'd had no siblings to love. All those years in the girls' home, whenever she'd started to feel connected to somebody, they'd been taken away from her. Grace was mature enough now to admit the truth. Those who hadn't left, Grace had walked away from. Because connection invited deep feelings, and deep feelings were dangerous. They weren't worth the cost. One time, only one time, she'd allowed herself to truly love another person. She'd poured her heart and her soul into saving Celia. And look where that had led. Which was why Grace had holed herself up in that cottage back in Washington. She should never have left. She'd been a fool to think she could save Lily. She needed to pass the child off and get away. Fast. She lifted her head, realizing that Lily was no longer screaming. Grace pushed herself off the couch. Upstairs, she knocked on Lily's closed door. Sweetheart, are you all right? When Lily didn't answer, Grace opened the door and peeked inside to find Lily on her bed, her back to Grace. She was sniffing quietly. I'm not trying to get rid of you. Grace sat on the mattress beside her, rubbing her back. I'm trying to find your family, your Nana. Don't you want to find her? A few beats passed before Lily's little shoulder lifted and dropped in a half-hearted shrug. "I'm sure she wants to find you," Grace said, hoping and praying that it was true, that the woman was alive and well and wondering about her granddaughter, maybe even searching for her. Lily pushed herself up and turned to face Grace, her gorgeous green eyes rimmed in red. "My own mama doesn't even want me. Maybe Nana doesn't either." Grace opened her arms, and Lily nestled against her. "Sweet child, you are amazing and priceless, worth more than all the gold and silver in all the world. I bet your grandmother is out there right now, wondering where you are. Shouldn't we do everything we can to find her?" "I guess." Lily leaned back and gazed at Grace. "But I want to stay with you. I love you." "Oh." Grace pulled her into a hug again. It wouldn't hurt to say the words. They were only words, after all. They didn't mean anything, but she couldn't make herself do it. Despite what she'd almost let herself believe the night before, Grace wasn't capable of real love. Real love didn't just understand others. Real love was powerful. Real love saved. She didn't possess that kind of love. She never would. "You are so loved," Grace finally said, "and so incredibly lovable." She patted the child's back and then extricated herself and stood. "But if you don't hurry up and get ready, you're going to be late to school." Lily sighed. "I don't want to go today." Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do. Growing up is about learning to do the hard things. Maturing is about learning to do the hard things with a good attitude. And you, young lady, she tapped Lily's little nose, are growing up and maturing right before my eyes. With a giant sigh, the child lumbered toward her closet. "I'm making pancakes." Even the promise of her favorite breakfast didn't lighten Lily's spirits. An hour later, after Grace dropped Lily at the school, she dialed Cassidy's number. Cassidy answered with, "So, Texas? With Andrew? How in the world?" "Reed and Jackie kept your dog. Reed stopped by the Patriot for breakfast and talked to James, who'd heard from Reed, so..." "Telephone, telegraph, pretty much anybody in Coventry. We're a pretty tight-knit crew, so you and Andrew?" "It's not like that. At least it shouldn't be. We're trying to find Lily's family." "Uh-huh, and Andrew went because he's a really nice guy, and his father's company owns a private jet." "Oh." That stunned her into silence. "I don't know if he wants people to know that, though," Grace was quick to add. "I probably shouldn't have said anything." "I won't spread the news around. Did you have any luck?" "Maybe. I'm hoping to get a call from somebody with information about her grandmother. If that doesn't pan out, then I'll have to expand the search." It was too early to get to the real reason for reaching out, so she shifted gears. "I wondered if today might be a good day for me to come by and check out the youth center." Cassidy had asked her more than once to stop by for a tour. Grace hadn't done it because she knew that Cassidy would start with a tour, but would quickly move on to telling her all the reasons she should go to work there, or at least volunteer. She'd hinted that the local youths could use Grace's gifts. Grace wouldn't be sucked in, but maybe she could talk Cassidy into helping her find a temporary home for Lily. "I'll be there by 9 o'clock, Cassidy said. "Stop by any time after that." Rather than drive back to the condo in the meantime, Grace found a little coffee shop a couple of blocks off the main drag. Cup of Josie's was located in an old Victorian house. When Grace stepped inside, the sense of coffee and baked goods wrapped around her like a soft scarf. A line snaked from the door to the glass-fronted counter at the far end of the largest space. Behind it, Grace glimpsed the kitchen, the only modern area in view. The furniture was old and used, not antiques, not valuable, just comfortable and worn. Scratched and faded tables, armchairs, side chairs. The hardwood floor was scuffed. It felt as if she'd just walked into somebody's granny's house. Behind the counter, the 20-something woman who seemed to be running the show didn't fit the bill. Grace ordered tea and a lemon scone, then snagged a padded chair in front of the bay window overlooking the street. The sweet pastry was the perfect accompaniment to the bitter tea, and she was glad she hadn't had time to eat her from a box pancakes that morning. She watched the world spin around her. A group of gray-haired men got coffee, and one of them took out a deck of cards, as if it made perfect sense to play gin rummy over breakfast. Two women, one bouncing a toddler on her hip, chose an old burgundy sofa against the far wall. They bent their heads together in serious conversation, while the child ate a chocolate-covered eclair, getting as much on his cheeks as in his mouth. One man came in wearing a scowl. So many people greeted him, teased him, and squeezed his shoulder in morale-boosting grips that by the time he left, he walked with a bounce in his steps and a smile on his face. People came and went, greeting each other by name. The owner guessed many orders before the customers had a chance to speak them. They joked and laughed, and some, as they left, hollered, "Thanks, Josie!" over their shoulders. This was what community looked like. And as usual, Grace was on the outside looking in. Never quite belonging. Because she wasn't normal. She wasn't like the rest of these people, for whom friendship came so easily. People capable of true love. She wanted to be part of them, always had. But she'd never been able to make it work. The one time she'd tried had ended with abysmal failure. At 10:15, she entered the brick building that housed the youth center, struck by the gleaming floors and modern equipment. Cassidy approached from an office behind a long counter, arms held wide. "How are you, my friend? I'd hoped I'd see more of you, but life has been so busy." Grace gave her a quick hug, careful of the baby bump that was bigger than the last time she'd seen her. "How are you feeling?" "Excellent. I was so tired the first trimester, but I almost feel like my old self again now." She rubbed a hand over her growing belly. "Except for this little guy doing karate kicks in there." She hooked her arm with Grace's. "Come on, I'll show you round." Grace had expected the place to be empty, but there were 3 teenagers in one of the rooms, heads bent over schoolwork. An older woman raised her hand in a wave as they walked by. "They were invited to leave school," Cassidy explained when they were out of earshot of the teens. "And their parents can't afford private schooling, so we opened a little classroom. Marjorie tutors them." "Suspended?" "Expelled, and well-deserved. But they're figuring it out." "All 3 of them?" "Partners in crime. They're lucky they're not in juvenile detention. They obeyed and did the work at first, because that's their next stop if they don't. They do the work now because Marjorie loves them, and they want to please her." "Amazing how well that works, huh? We learned that from the best." "Mama Lucy." Cassidy's voice held wonder as she said the words. "My goal is to love as well as she did." Grace wished she could say the same. Her goal was to not let herself love. But then, Mama Lucy's love worked. The youth center was amazing, as Grace had known it would be. Cassidy had been a wonder when she'd run the girls' home in Seattle alongside Mama Lucy. No matter how hard Grace had tried, she'd never been able to fill Cassidy's shoes. When they finished the tour, Cassidy led her into the office and indicated a comfortable chair across from her desk. "You need some coffee?" "I had tea before I came by." She looked around at the well-appointed space. "You either have a really generous town or a really generous group of benefactors." "Yes to both." Cassidy leaned back in her chair and rubbed her baby belly. "HCI, Hamilton Clothiers, donates most of what we need to stay afloat." "Oh, that's right. They have an office here or something?" "Their corporate offices and their factory. All their clothes are made right up the street. The owner, Chelsea, is a dear friend. I think you met her, the one with the English accent." Now that Cassidy had mentioned her, Grace remembered meeting the pretty blonde at church. "She owns HCI?" Cassidy nodded. "Her parents started it, and she inherited. She's young to have lost both her parents." "There's a story there," Cassidy said. "Not mine to tell. Anyway, the town is generous too. They contribute, volunteer. I'm very fortunate. The kids are very fortunate." "True, so it practically runs itself. But I'm about to go on maternity leave." She gave Grace a knowing look. "I need somebody." "It can't be me, Cassidy." "It could be if you wanted it to. You have a gift." "It's not a gift. It's a curse. and I'm doing my best not to let it destroy me. She studied Grace through squinted eyes. What happened to you? Not a story Grace planned to tell Cassidy, or anybody. I was hoping you could do me a favor. I need to find a place for Lily while I search for her family. We didn't learn much this weekend, but Andrew is convinced that the man who claimed to be her father can't be related to her. Cassidy leaned forward. What? Why does he think that? Both he and her mother have blue eyes, and Lily has green. Apparently it's nearly impossible. Not completely, but… She shrugged. He didn't explain all the genetic stuff, but he seems to know what he's talking about. What are you hoping for? She has a grandmother out there somewhere. I need to find her. Maybe I can reunite them. Why can't you keep Lily with you? It's just… She swallowed hard. This weekend was rough on her, going back and finding nothing but an empty house. I think she'd be better off with a more stable family than running all over the country with me. This search can't be done from here? I don't know what it'll take. I don't want to hurt her. So you're looking for a family to take her for a couple of days? Or longer, or… Permanently. I mean, not permanently, but until I find relatives. Cassidy sat back and studied her closely. Grace forced herself to hold her old friend's gaze. Finally, Cassidy said, "You don't think it'll hurt her if you dump her?" "I'm not trying to dump her. I'm trying to make sure she's taken care of." Cassidy leaned forward, as if to impress her with her words. "You do that by taking care of her, yourself." "I'm not… I can't." A sob crawled up Grace's throat, but she swallowed it back. She deserves somebody who can. Grace's voice cracked as the words came out. A long moment passed before Cassidy shook her head. "What happened to you? Can you help me? Do you know anybody?" "I don't know anybody who'd be willing to do that. How did you get custody anyway?" Grace hadn't told her friend the story. She hadn't wanted to put Cassidy in the position of having to choose between doing what was legal and doing what was right. Now she pushed back in her chair and stood. "It's a long story." "I'd like to hear it." Cassidy stood as well. "I have all day." "I'll figure something out." She stepped toward the door. "Grace?" She turned. "I appreciate all you've done for me, for us. I shouldn't have come to you." Shouldn't have come to Coventry at all. What was she doing there? All those people who knew everything about everything? It was just a matter of time before somebody figured out the truth. Cassidy said, "Don't leave." "I've taken up too much of… don't leave Coventry. Or at least, don't leave without telling me. Please, I'll do whatever I can to help you and Lily. You have people here who care about you. James, me, Andrew." The mention of his name set butterflies in flight, but the weight of anxiety pushed them back down. "Just promise you won't leave without saying goodbye." Grace nodded and hurried out the door. She was the one who was supposed to be intuitive, but Cassidy had seen right through her. Her fight or flight instinct had kicked in, and everything in her whispered flight.
Chapter 21. Myron finally understood the connection. Grace had come to Coventry because of Cassidy Sullivan. According to her bio on the Youth Center's website, Cassidy Sullivan had worked at a home for troubled girls in Seattle, the same place where Grace used to work. Though solving that mystery brought a level of satisfaction, it was nothing to the satisfaction he'd felt after learning where Middleton had taken Grace and Lily the day before. He'd followed at a safe distance, not in his Missouri van, but in his black sedan, the kind nobody looked twice at, until the BMW had turned into a parking lot near the airport in Manchester. A bribe slipped to the right person, and Myron learned the private jet he'd seen through his binoculars beyond the unassuming building had been bound for Austin. There was only one reason for Grace to go to Austin. They must have found out about Lily's grandmother. Myron should have taken care of the woman years before. He'd never wanted to harm the lady. He took no pleasure in causing pain. But Grace had left him no choice. Darla Springer would pay for Grace's poor choices.
Chapter 22. Andrew left the office late Monday afternoon. It had been a long, busy day. Andrew, Jackie, and Braden had studied the resumes and educational backgrounds of the prospective employees coming to tour the lab the following weekend. Though all of them would be considered for positions at B&B, there were a few whose resumes had risen to the top, and Andrew was eager to meet them, to try to get them to at least consider a move north. The young people, all in their final months of earning either bachelor's or master's degrees, would arrive in Manchester on Friday afternoon. They'd be treated to meals and cocktails and tours of the area, including emphasis on the good schools and affordable real estate. Though Jackie and Braden would be there, Andrew and the event planner were in charge. Andrew would have to stay in Plymouth Friday through Sunday, which meant as much as he wanted to take Grace on a real date, that would have to wait. Unless, if he could find a babysitter for Lily, Grace could be his date for the dinner Saturday night. Reed and Carly would be there, Jackie's husband and Braden's wife. So why not? He sent a text to the event planner telling her about his +1, and when she responded with a thumbs up, his spirits lightened. On his way home to Coventry, he dialed Grace's number. Her quick hello sounded rushed and frustrated. Definitely not the reception he'd hoped for. "Everything all right?" She blew out a breath. "Yeah, fine. What's wrong?" Grace lowered her voice. "It was such a busy weekend. I'm sure Lily will be better tomorrow. She's just tired and cranky." "Tired, I can understand. But I feel anything but cranky." "Yeah." Grace's single word held no amusement. "I could pick up dinner and—" "Don't you have your game night?" They were expecting him, and it promised to be a good game. But still, "I could skip this one." "No, don't." "Wow." He tried to sound lighthearted when he added, "You really know how to make a guy feel wanted." "We're eating dinner now. Then it'll be bath time and an early bedtime." In the background, Lily whined, "I'm not tired. I don't want to go to bed." Grace sighed. "You sure I can't help?" he asked. "I wish you could." "I could come over after you put her to bed." He felt a little pathetic, but his desire to see Grace overcame any embarrassment. And anyway, she already knew how he felt. He was still coming to grips with that. The thing she'd told him was weird, and he wasn't sure what to do with it. He couldn't figure out if she'd been given an incredible gift or if she just had a really wild imagination. She was obviously intuitive, but nothing. He trusted her. She believed she had a gift. Who was he to tell her she was wrong? "I would love to see you," she said, sounding almost like she meant it. "But Lily had a rough night last night, and tonight's shaping up to be about the same. I think I'd better get some sleep. This is one of those days I just want to be over." "Okay then." Andrew kept his voice chipper, hiding his disappointment. "I'll call you tomorrow." He'd wait to ask her to join him for the company dinner when she was in a more agreeable state of mind. Though he was sorry he wouldn't get to see her, he figured he could use the time between when he got home and when he had to leave for Braden's house to look at NBC's financial records. 2 hours later, he parked on the street in front of Braden and Carly's house, mind spinning with all he'd learned. The news was not good at all. Reed answered Braden's door with, "Howdy, partner." Jackie and Reed had kept Regis while they'd been gone. Dad was generous, but not generous enough to allow a dog on his private jet. They'd picked Regis up on their way home from the airport the night before, but Andrew hadn't seen Reed. Apparently, the man had been saving up his teasing for tonight. "Having just been there," Andrew said, "I can confirm that that is the worst Texas accent I've ever heard." Before Reed could come up with a witty response, Garrett said, "Texas?" And then Braden from his chair said, "He flew with his new girlfriend to Texas for the weekend." Andrew hadn't made it off the front step yet. "Did I just step into the girls' locker room?" Reed moved back to let Andrew enter. "Spend a lot of time there, did you? Fixing your pantyhose and whatnot?" Andrew couldn't help the chuckle. "Idiot. Moron," James added. "Putz." Carly came down the stairs, little Desi in her arms. "You guys watch your potty mouths." She stopped on the landing and squeezed Andrew's hand. "They're living vicariously through you." He peeked at the perfect little baby. She looked so much like her mother, it was eerie. "My life's not that exciting, little one. Pay no attention to these people." When he focused on Carly, her eyes sparkled and a grin stretched across her lips. "So, how was Texas?" He blew out a long breath and reached for the door handle beside him. "Maybe I'll just see you guys next week." That brought laughs and insincere apologies, but he allowed himself to be pulled in, though he didn't respond to their ribbing or the questions about Grace. He wasn't ready to put a name to what they had. He certainly wasn't ready for the teasing that would surely come if he did. The conversation moved past Grace and onto sports, politics, and the economy. It was halftime before Reed asked, "Any update on your father's company?" Andrew couldn't stop the groan that escaped at the thought of what he'd discovered. He nodded toward Fitz, who'd snagged a spot on the couch. "You were right. He's skimming and too stupid to cover it up." "Remind me, this is your brother?" Fitz asked. "Half-brother." "How'd your dad receive the news?" Reed asked. "I just figured it out. I haven't yet calculated how much has been taken, but there's no doubt. The numbers just don't add up. They did the first few years Chet was in charge, but the last 18 months or so—" "You have a guess?" James asked. "Raw estimate, 75 to 100 grand. From his chair beside Andrews, Thomas whistled. Shaking his head, James said, "I had a server working for me last year who used to pocket cash every so often. The numbers were a little off whenever she worked, and I couldn't figure out why. I thought she was incompetent or something. When I finally realized what was going on, it was just a couple $100, but I was furious. I can't imagine if my own kid did something like that." "It's such a betrayal," Reed added, "to have someone you work with, someone you trust." "Yeah," Andrew said. "I don't want to be the one to tell Dad." "You're sure it was him?" Braden leaned forward and propped his knees on his elbows. "No chance anybody else could have done it? A manager? Someone in accounting who figures he's an easy mark?" Andrew shrugged. "All I know is what I'm seeing in the books. I don't know who has access to the accounts. I guess my dad'll have to figure all that out." "He had to know something like that was going on," Fitz said. "Maybe he wanted you to confirm what he already suspected." Andrew considered the idea, then discarded it. "Dad hates that Chet and I don't get along. I can't imagine that he'd have asked me to do this if he thought there was any chance." "Why ask you then?" Fitz shifted to face him better. "Think about it. Your dad wants his two sons to get along, but then asks one to investigate the other's work. Why?" Andrew had asked himself that question more than once. Maybe he figured nobody at Middleton would tell him the truth. "And he knew you'd be honest," Reed said. "You wouldn't sugarcoat it. You wouldn't worry about your father's reaction." Andrew couldn't help the bark of unamused laughter. He'd be wrong about that. Snagging a slice of cheese off the tray on the coffee table, James said, "It's not your fault your brother's a thief." "Still sucks you have to be the one to break the news to your dad, though," Reed added. But Andrew did have to, sooner rather than later. Once he finished cataloging what he'd learned and adding up the discrepancies, he'd set up a time for the two of them to get together. This didn't feel like news he should deliver over the phone. Andrew knocked on Grace's door at 5:30 the next afternoon, the heavy wind whipping through his light jacket. He'd left work early in hopes of catching Grace and Lily before dinner. He shifted the steaming hot pizza box into his other hand, telling himself to be patient and calling himself all kinds of idiot for not having tried calling again. But he dialed her a couple of times that day, and Grace had rejected his calls. He couldn't read her feelings, not the way she could read his, but when he'd kissed her on Sunday, he'd never felt so connected to another person in his life. On the jet, she'd claimed to feel the same. But by the time they'd landed, he'd felt her pulling away, putting up walls, putting distance between them. After 2 days, that distance felt as wide as the Atlantic. If she planned to end what they had before it had even had a chance to begin, Andrew wasn't going to make it easy on her. If she didn't want him, then she was going to have to spell it out. Until she did, he would pursue her. Finally, the door swung open, and Lily stood in the entry, tear streaks on her cheeks. Before he could say a word, she turned and yelled, "I told you! It's Mr. Middleton! And I told you you're not allowed to answer the door without permission." Grace approached from behind, a frown marring her pretty face. "It's not safe." "I looked through the window." "You didn't ask." "I hate you." The girl swiveled and bounded up the stairs, leaving Andrew on the stoop holding a pizza and feeling like an intruder. Grace took the child's place at the door. "Sorry about that. We're having a hard day." Maybe he should have taken the hint when she'd rejected his calls. He held out the pizza like a peace offering. Not that he'd done anything wrong, not as far as he knew, though the way Grace was peering at him made him happy the would-be dinner separated them. It's not a good night for company. It's the perfect night for company. You both need a buffer. He lifted his free hand to his chest and offered a smile. I volunteer. She almost smiled at that. Please? He lowered his voice. I miss you. Her gaze flicked to the staircase. He couldn't see what she was looking at, but guessed Lily was there when Grace said, Can you be polite? The child must have answered properly because Grace stepped back. If you dare. Figuring that was the best invitation he was going to get, he stepped inside. Half cheese, half pepperoni. I didn't know what you ladies would like. She's pepperoni all the way, but I prefer cheese. Or pineapple. That's not a pizza topping. He walked past her to the kitchen. It's a garnish for pina coladas. No response from Grace. Not even a chuckle. Lily and Grace were quiet as they ate, leaving him to make conversation. But what did he have to say that an 8-year-old girl wouldn't find boring? He did his best, and Grace at least rewarded him with an occasional smile. No matter how many questions he asked, he couldn't get either one of them talking. Finally, Grace shooed Lily away for a bath. Wash your hair and your body, and use soap. The child rolled her eyes and then disappeared up the stairs. When she was gone, Grace collapsed in her chair and ran her fingers through her hair. It seemed as if she'd expended all the energy she had for the day. Unfortunately, it wasn't even 6:30. He stacked their plates on the far side of the table. What's going on? She does this thing. She'd been doing it since I first met her. She finds items that are important to me, and she hides them. She doesn't steal them. She just moves them to weird places. What do you mean? Like what? She shrugged. A mug. My slippers. She touched her earlobe. My favorite earrings. I've always been able to find them before. I've asked her to stop, and she finally did. She hadn't done it since she took my keys the first week we lived here. I take it that's changed. She hid my laptop. I can't find it anywhere. And she absolutely refuses to tell me where it is, or even admit she did it. Not that she's ever done that. So she's never actually confessed to taking your things? Maybe she didn't. Grace sat up. The spark in her eyes could have lit a blaze. Who else could it be? He refused to rise to her level of anger. He didn't know if Lily had done anything wrong. He knew he hadn't. I'm only saying, maybe she doesn't realize she's doing it. Maybe it's subconscious or something. You know I have a degree in child psychology. I didn't know that. You don't talk much about your past. Oh, she sat back. Well, I do. And it's not subconscious. I don't know why she does it, but she does. She's never even argued with me about it before. She's never told me where anything was, but she never denied having done it. No, this is just stubbornness. She's mad at me, and she's found a way to get back at me. For what? Grace stood and snatched her purse from where she kept it hanging from the pantry door. Honestly, I don't have the energy for this tonight. Let me pay you back for the pizza. What? It was? If I pay you, then I won't feel as guilty about asking you to leave. He stood as well, stepping around the table to get nearer to her. What's gotten into you? Lily's 8. Her behavior matches her age. Yours, on the other hand, don't scold me like a child. Don't act like one. No. She yanked a 20 from her wallet and held it toward him. Take it. He squelched the words that came to his mind and forced himself to breathe. Slowly, he approached and wrapped his hands around her fists, careful not to touch her palm to palm. The last thing she needed was to add his feelings of frustration and hurt to whatever she was feeling in that moment. Just take a breath. She held her glare, the fury in it hot enough to leave a mark. A moment passed until, finally, she deflated. He pulled her close and wrapped her in his arms. It's okay. Though he wasn't sure exactly what it was, and he had no idea whether it was okay or not. I'm sorry. Her words were muffled against his button-down. I didn't mean to question you. You're doing your best. You're doing a great job with her, and you obviously know Lily a lot better than I do. I was only trying to help. When she backed up, he wiped a tear trickling down her cheek. Hey now, what can I do? Nothing, just the pizza was good. I'm sorry we're both so out of sorts. He urged Grace back into her chair and took his own, pulling it closer to her so he could keep his voice low. Did the trip to Texas bring this on? She thinks I'm trying to get rid of her. Well, that's ridiculous. You're a foster parent. She understands what that means, right? Grace's gaze slid toward the stairs. It's complicated for a little kid. She's grown attached to me. Like you have her, of course. How could you not fall in love with her? Knowing you could lose custody of her any day has to be tearing you up. What you're doing is so noble. Grace flinched as if he'd wounded her. It is, he pressed. What you're doing with her is amazing. He slid the tip of his finger from her temple to her jaw. You're amazing. She seemed to lean into his touch, and then suddenly she backed away, stood, shook her head. Before she could speak, he stood as well. It doesn't hurt to have a friend, someone you can lean on and confide in. I want to be that someone for you. He expected her to argue or order him out of her house, but she didn't, and he wasn't going to leave unless she forced him to. Instead, he slid his hand around her upper arm. She seemed almost weak as he led her to the living room and settled her on the sofa. He sat beside her and pulled her against his side. See, it's not so bad. She cuddled there but didn't say anything. Grace just needed to rest for a few minutes, not think about all the worries pressing in on her. Rather than question her further, he snatched the remote and found the Food Network. A few minutes passed while they watched a chef make the perfect fried chicken. Beside him, Grace said, I need to find my laptop. You want help looking for it? Her head shook against his chest. I'll figure it out, or I'll get her to find it for me. Let me know if you change your mind. When she didn't respond, he asked a question that had been dogging him since Monday morning. Keeping his voice low, he said, What did her social worker say? Oh, I haven't called her. He shifted to look at her. Why not? And tell her what? That you think Myron isn't her real father. We have no proof, just your suspicion. We need more information. Right, but don't you think? He was confused. What would it hurt to tell her? It's complicated. These things are complicated. That was the second time she'd brushed off his questions with that response. He was a relatively intelligent guy, though. He was pretty sure he could keep up, and it didn't seem that complicated to him. But Grace wasn't in the state of mind to listen. Rather than argue, he said, You know what you're doing. She left his side and settled against the arm of the couch a good foot away. If that neighbor, Ruby, doesn't call me back soon, I'm going to hire somebody to track down Darla Springer. Maybe you should call the Freedom Hill Police Department. Maybe they know something. She blinked a couple of times. Why would they? If the girl was kidnapped, then we'd have found information about that online, don't you think? But if Myron isn't, we don't know he isn't her father. All we have is your suspicion. His suspicion was based on pretty solid facts, but saying so wouldn't help. How about the county clerk's office? They'd have birth records. Maybe they could tell us her birth parents. I tried that. The words were sharp, irritated. Called them yesterday. It's private information. They won't release the records to me. Okay. He tried to keep his voice calm and kind. I have a friend whose specialty is finding lost people. You probably met him at church. The red-headed guy married to the woman with the English accent. Chelsea, who owns HCI? Husband is Dylan. She nodded and some of her ire seemed to drain away. Cassidy was talking about them today. Dylan could find the grandmother, probably in a matter of minutes, maybe even Lily's mother. At the flicker of hope brightening her expression, he added, He used to be a detective, and a darn good one. I know he'd be willing to help. Grace swallowed and the hope he'd seen in her eyes dulled. I'll keep it in mind. I could call. That's okay. I can get his number. She stood. I'm sorry, I just can't do this tonight. I need to get Lily in bed, and I need to find my laptop. He stood as well, feeling off balance and confused. This night hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. No matter how hard he'd tried, everything he'd said was wrong. He wanted to help, but Grace obviously didn't want that. The chasm between them only seemed to be growing. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have shown up uninvited. She walked to the door and opened it. The pizza was delicious. Thank you. On his way over that evening, he'd hoped they might share another kiss. The hope of that had blown away almost immediately. The hope that he could leave with him and Grace still on friendly terms. Even that felt chilled in the cold wind seeping in beneath the storm door. He considered grabbing the pizza box to toss it out so she wouldn't have to make a trip to the dumpster. But the way she was looking at him, like a nasty rash she'd do anything to be rid of, had him striding toward the door. He paused in front of her. Wanting more than anything to take her in his arms, he settled for leaning down and kissing her temple. "I'm sorry you're having a hard day. Call me if you need anything." She nodded but didn't force words past her lips, which were pressed so tightly together that they'd turned almost white. He had no idea what was going on behind those guarded ease. No idea how he could bridge the gap she seemed intent on keeping between them. "Good night." When he reached the bottom of the stoop, he turned to wave but found the door already closing between them. This was probably a terrible idea. Andrew parked outside the old house on the edge of the lake and knocked on the door. So unlike the condo community where he lived, this place was not in a neighborhood at all. In fact, if not for the campground a couple of 100 yards up the road, James and Cassidy's home would be completely secluded. James answered the door and held it open. Andrew'd called on his way, and Cassidy'd told him to stop by, so he was taken aback by James's glower. "Did she not tell you I was coming?" He shook the expression off his face. "She's had a long day, and with the baby coming, she needs to rest." "I promised to keep it brief." "See that you—" He cut off his own words and plastered on a smile as Cassidy stepped into the entry from the living area. "I'll be in here." James stepped into the living room, and a moment later the TV came on. "Don't mind him." Cassidy glanced through the door at her husband, speaking low. She rubbed her growing middle. "The bigger I get, the more protective he gets." "Can't blame him for that," Andrew said. "I just had a couple of questions." She led him through the dining room and into the sizable eat-in kitchen. She perched on the edge of a chair. "Obviously, I won't divulge any confidences." "I know." He sat and angled to face her. "I just hoped you could give me some background." Cassidy studied him with those striking blue eyes, her gaze penetrating enough that he fought not to squirm. "You've got it bad, huh?" He tried to shrug off the question, but she seemed as insightful as Grace. "I'm not going to lie, and I'm not going to tell you anything I haven't told her yet. Suffice it to say, I'm moving toward Grace, not backing away. She, however—" He wasn't sure how to say what he was trying to say. He settled for, "I don't think it's because she doesn't have feelings for me." Cassidy dipped her head, acknowledging that. "We shared a pretty intimate moment." At that, her eyebrows rose. "Not that intimate. A kiss. Or a few. I thought—" He felt like an idiot, talking about this with a woman he barely knew. That he was there was a testament to how desperate he felt. Is there some reason why she wouldn't want to get involved with me? Or maybe it's just me. Maybe she's just not that into me. She had some issues in her past. I thought she'd work through them, and I obviously can't tell you." "She told me about her stepfather," Andrew said, "and how she ended up in the girls' home." Cassidy's eyes widened with surprise. "That says a lot, Andrew. She obviously trusts you. She must care for you, or she wouldn't have shared that. It's a pretty personal story." His heart raced like a schoolboy's hearing his first crush liked him back. With every tick of the wall clock, he felt more like an idiot for being there. But something was keeping Grace from diving in with him, and seeing as how he was already drowning in his feelings, he'd really like her to do more than dip her toes in the water. Cassidy's tone was careful when she said, "Grace is special. She's incredibly insightful, almost to the degree that it's hard to comprehend. She told me that too, about the—" Then he felt the need to tread carefully. Maybe Cassidy didn't know. He held his hand palm up, and she sat back. "She told you that? About her gift?" "Sunday. She sort of demonstrated." He swallowed the rest of his words, remembering the moment when they'd kissed, when he'd felt all the feelings, knowing she was feeling them too. It had been more intimate than anything he'd ever experienced. Considering they'd stopped at a kiss, that was saying something. "Huh." Cassidy looked beyond him, head shaking. "Did she tell you about Celia?" "Who?" After I left Seattle, she took over my position at the girls' home. She was so good with the girls, better than I could ever hope to be, because she understood them in a way nobody else could. But there was this one girl, Celia. She'd run away from home after suffering repeated abuse at the hands of her father and her older brother. She was only 13, and she'd already attempted suicide multiple times before she came to us. She blinked a couple of times, then said, "This isn't personal about Grace, so..." After a long pause, she continued, "It's okay if I tell you. I hope, anyway. You can trust me. And Grace can trust me. I'm trying to be sensitive to what she'd want. I don't think she'd mind your knowing, especially considering everything else she's told you. I suspect her having kept quiet about it is more because she doesn't like to talk about it or think about it. Anyway, Grace did everything in her power to reach Celia. She poured herself into that child. The thing is, some people are so broken that they're crushed. Celia was crushed. She'd given her life to Christ. She knew where she was going, and she was ready to get there. Oh no, she was still alive when Grace found her, but she'd lost a lot of blood. Cassidy rubbed a vertical line across the inside of her wrist, and a sick feeling settled in Andrew's gut. Grace called 911 and went with her to the hospital. She held her hand the whole time, weeping and praying and begging Celia to fight. His mind picked up on one part of that, shining a spotlight on it, holding her hand. Cassidy nodded, experiencing it all, and being able to do nothing about it. Grace quit the next day. She moved out of Seattle and never looked back. No wonder she seemed so broken. No wonder she was trying to keep her distance. What must she have felt in her body, in her heart, as Celia's life had slipped away? How could Andrew, how could anybody help to guard Grace's heart? He didn't know, but he was willing to try. He was willing to dedicate his life to protecting her, to keeping her from getting that invested in another person, even while encouraging her to use her gift. How, he had no idea, but with God's help, he'd figure it out. Had she picked up on some brokenness in him, something that reminded her of Celia? He didn't think so. Maybe she feared connection to anybody. He thought back on all the interactions he'd noticed between Grace and Lily. Grace cared for the child, but she kept her distance too. He'd never hear Grace say that she loved Lily, not to Lily's face or speaking about her. She held her, but never for very long. She managed all the girl's physical needs but seemed to distance herself from the emotional ones. He chalked it up to the desire to not get too attached, knowing Lily would eventually go to someone else. But maybe there was more to it than that. Maybe she was afraid to connect with her. He remembered Lily's innocent comment the previous week. "Miss Grace doesn't like to hold hands. It makes her feel funny." Grace never held Lily's hand. "That does shed some light," Andrew said. "But I'm confused. When did she move to New Hampshire? And if she was so intent on keeping her distance, she must have healed to some degree to become a foster parent." Cassidy leaned back. Confusion flickered in her eyes, but she masked it quickly. "I don't have all the details, only what Mama Lucy told me. And Mama Lucy knew nothing about that. I have no idea how she got custody of Lily." At least some of his questions had been answered, but he felt like more had presented themselves. Why would a woman intent on protecting herself take custody of a little girl, even if she understood Lily's background? It was one thing to turn Myron in for what she suspected, but then to take responsibility for Lily? She must adore the child, and yet she kept her emotional distance. He didn't understand, but he would. He'd do everything in his power to get to know Grace, to figure out what made her tick. Strange as her gift was, rocky as her history, he was falling for her more and more every day. If she tried to put up walls between them, he'd work just as hard to tear them down.